Hi guys, it's Geekonomics here, bringing you figure 11 of the A593 GCSE Economics stimulus material. Without further ado, let's get straight to it. So the title of this particular set of data, figure 11, is GDP per capita, per person, measured in US dollars, and the percentage of the labour force that completed primary, secondary and tertiary education in selected countries in 2012. And you'll note in the particular extract there's a little asterisk there corresponding to the asterisk in the data, just saying a little bit more about what they mean by tertiary education, insofar as it's not just university education, could be some type of higher level vocational qualification or something similar. So ladies and gentlemen, what are we presented with here? We are presented with, as you can see, a number of countries, 2, 4, 6, 8, 9 countries. And I presume that what the exam board are trying to get us to ascertain here is whether or not there is a link between a country's standard of living and the number of people in that particular country who are engaging in either primary, secondary, tertiary, or all three of those forms of education. So you can see that this particular data here is linked and ranked on this second column of GDP per capita at current prices in US dollars. And we'll say a little bit about what that current prices means in a moment. But it's ranked in rank order from top to bottom in US dollars. So Switzerland at the top with a GDP per capita of $83,295 per person, and Cambodia at the bottom with a GDP, that's an annual GDP per person of just $948 per person. So a few questions which you may wish to consider, ladies and gentlemen, in your preparation and revision would be: make sure that you can define the term labour force. Remember that the labour force is not the number of people, for example, living in the UK. So let's say that that's, for the sake of argument, 64 million. Well, that is not obviously the size of the UK labour force, that is the size of the population. Our labour force is obviously between 16 and retirement age of 65, 67 for me, when I'm able to claim the old state pension. So make sure that you're able to define it. Analyse the data in the table, so we're going to talk a little bit more about the data in the table, and discuss whether there is a correlation between education and GDP per capita, which really I think is the key focus of this data set. Explain what other factors ought to be taken into consideration when considering a country's competitiveness. When we look at this data, we'll see, yes, education is important and it is a factor, but are there other factors which determine a country's competitiveness? I would suggest there are, and there are plenty of them. And then lastly, with reference to the data, evaluate. So consider the pros and cons, the pluses and the minuses, the advantages and disadvantages of the importance of investment in training and education relative to a country's GDP per capita. Okay, so let's have a little bit of a think about this, ladies and gentlemen. So let's think about what we mean, first of all, by GDP per capita. So figure 11, it's all about GDP per capita and education, and we're thinking, is there a link between education, economic growth and standard of living? Certainly Tony Blair, former UK Prime Minister, as I'm sure you well know, when elected in May 1997, he rode into Downing Street on the back of a very famous speech now, where he said that he had three focuses for the economy, as it were, back in 1997. And those three focuses were education, education and education, ladies and gentlemen. So clearly, back in those days, education was considered to be very important as a driver, potentially, to economic growth. GDP per capita. So you know that GDP is the total money value of goods and services produced by countries' resources in a given period of time, usually 1 year. So it measures the size of the economy. GDP per capita, we take that big number and then we divide it by the total population in the economy. So that gives us an average, ladies and gentlemen, figure for earnings of every individual in the economy. So if we look at the data set here, we're saying that every individual, on average in Switzerland, has that value. United Kingdom, let's keep it close to home, average of $41,051 US per person. Now, there are a couple of things to think about just when we're looking at this data. Number one, it is just an average. And of course, averages can be very skewed, either upwards or downwards, dependent upon whether or not your country has a large number of very high net wealth individuals, or vice versa, low net worth individuals. So the fact that it is an average, ladies and gentlemen, that is not really, it's a rather crude measure, as I've said here. It's a rather crude measure. So if you think about, for example, if you had an economy which was just made up of 1, 2, 3 individuals, and this particular person earns £100 a year, this particular person earns £100 a year, but this particular person here earns £1,600 per year. Well, if you take an average, that's 1,800 divided by 3, then obviously the average of that is £600 per person per year. GDP per capita of 600 per person per year. But in reality, that has been very much skewed by the fact that we have got in our data set one very relatively high net wealth individual, and so that skews the data. So just bear that in mind. It is an average measure, it's a rather crude measure, and it doesn't really tell us, well, it doesn't tell us anything about the income distribution in that data. Nonetheless, it is a one method of comparing the economic performance of countries, and hence we can see it ranked on GDP per capita in current prices. Now, the current prices is an important factor here, ladies and gentlemen, because that is the same as saying GDP at nominal prices. Now, what does that mean? It means that any inflation in the economy is not stripped out, and so some of these figures could be artificially raised by the fact that there is rampant inflation in the economy. Now, of course, you're less likely to get that in these more developed economies of the world. However, it's more likely to be more ingrained in the less developed economies in the world. So do bear that in mind. That's another factor which sort of makes this data slightly unreliable, that current prices impact. You'll remember, of course, that the opposite of that is GDP at constant prices, or something called real, R-E-A-L, real GDP. But nonetheless, we've got the data there, and then really we want to look at that data, we want to try and interpret that data and to just see whether or not, ladies and gentlemen, let me bring the desktop annotation up. We want to look and see whether or not there is any correlation between these income levels and the numbers of people in education. So let's look at column 1, percentage of the labour force that completed only, very important, only primary education. Well, one would anticipate, one would think that the higher the GDP value, then the lower this number will be, because one would expect that most people would therefore have completed at least their primary schooling. So if we look at this data and we sort of travel down, we can see that there are a couple of anomalies, one might say, in the data. So if you look at Switzerland, Germany, United Kingdom, for example, these are wealthy economies, developed economies, and the percentage of the population that completed only primary education is relatively small, which is what we would expect. Similarly, one might say also, for example, that the less well-off economies, so Turkey, Namibia, Morocco, those countries there, we would be saying, well, given their relative low levels of GDP, then one might anticipate that quite a high proportion of their population would only have completed their primary education. But there are a couple of anomalies there, ladies and gentlemen, so let's look at Singapore here, second in the rankings, but yet 20% of its population only completed primary education. Look down here, for example, Cambodia. Very bottom of our list, and yet 28%, so it's relatively low, of its population only completed primary education, and in Malaysia 17%. So there is a correlation there, but it's not, one might say, a straight line correlation between the two. Let's have a look then at primary and secondary, so completing both primary and secondary. So again, one would anticipate that the higher GDP per capita would mean that the population would have to have completed more primary and secondary education. So let's look down the data and see again if there are any. Again, you know, Singapore, of the top countries here, does stand out for being relatively lower. But again, let's look at some countries here. So in Malaysia, for example, 55% of the population completing both primary and secondary education, yet the GDP per capita is quite low. So the others more or less fall into line, I would say, there. And then as we move towards completing primary, secondary and tertiary, and again we're looking probably for higher numbers correlating to the higher standards of living in terms of GDP per capita, and again that really is what we're seeing here. So primary, secondary, tertiary, high. But again, look here, Malaysia, again pretty high number there, but relatively low GDP per person, and the rest sort of fall into line more or less. So I think you can see that as you move across the data, ladies and gentlemen, the importance of education and the relative importance with regard to standard of living does tend to get more and more important. Now, of course, for you people who are probably considering A-level study and then higher level at third, tertiary level education, this is going to be a good thing for you. So that's really it, ladies and gentlemen, in that respect. So what can we say about this data? Let's just take our desktop annotate off. Let's move back. So there are a couple of things that we must consider in the data. So first of all, when we're looking at these percentages, and we highlighted a few percentages there, remember, we're not told actually what the population sizes are here. So that plays an important part. I mean, 20% of Singapore's population could be the same number of people as 6.8% of the UK, so we're not told anything about population sizes, so that's something to factor into the equation. But generally speaking, we can see that there is a correlation between education, which we can also call HCI, ladies and gentlemen, human capital investment. So there is a correlation between that and the standard of living. What else does the data not tell us? Well, it doesn't tell us anything about the standards of provision. We in this country, we have Ofsted, as you will well know, the education watchdog, monitoring what goes on in education in the UK. Does that happen in these other countries? Or all of them? Certainly the less developed countries? No. We have no information about class sizes. We have no information about teachers' qualifications. All of these things, ladies and gentlemen, that we're not told about. And of course, education, to quote Tony Blair, well, education is not the only determinant, ladies and gentlemen, of a country's competitiveness. There are so many other factors, and I've listed a few of them here for your consideration and delectation. So, what about, for example, the abundance of labour? One of the reasons why China and India are so competitive is because they are labour abundant, they are rich in labour, hence it is cheap, hence it makes them relatively more price competitive. We know nothing about the state of technology in these economies, or at least we're not told. We could make a guess, but we're not told. An educated guess, obviously. Exchange rates impact upon competitiveness. Weak currency makes your goods relatively less expensive, therefore more internationally competitive. The relative wage rates and prices, again, wage rates and prices, internal to the economy, structural within the economy. If those are kept nice and low, that makes you internationally competitive. Corporation tax rates, you've heard me talk about this before. Corporation tax, very clever fiscal policy because it's a supply side fiscal policy. Reduce corporation tax, so that's a fiscal policy, that then encourages more big companies to come to your country, hence increases supply in your economy. So that's a big thing to do with multinational companies, which we're coming on to actually in the next figure. And we don't know anything about trade barriers. If you've got lots of trade barriers erected against your goods, then regardless of how price competitive you are domestically, internationally, you may not be. So that really, ladies and gentlemen, is all I'm going to say about this particular figure. And the real backbone to this is really, is there a correlation between education and standard of living? Yes, there is. Explain why that might be, but then also weigh up these other factors. That's it, ladies and gentlemen. Bye for now. I'll be back pretty much immediately with the final figure 12. Bye.